127 at the bottom of the page. I don't know what page it is on the digital copy. 130. 130 of the PDF. So if your device, whatever you're using to follow along, has that. The reason I don't print these is because this series is 800 pages. And so if I had, say like 10 people that wanted to have a copy of it, then I would be printing 8,000 pages. So we'd have to buy a new printer, not just buy new toner and paper. So you can follow along if you have any questions or whatever, or if you want to take a peek at my copy, I've got notes that I've written and highlighted stuff and all that. And Brother Brian has a digital copy or access to the digital copy. So and if you I think I gave access to a few people on that. If you have if you've lost access and you need it again, let me know. I can get you a link for it. But this is so much easier though to have people use a digital copy than it is for. Can't get in. Let me help you here. Oh, you're talking about the internet connection. Switch to the other one. Let's see here. That one. That's the one you're connected to. So
I am
or
in?
Should be. Give it a sec. Yep, you're in.
I just need to find the Dropbox.
Mm-hmm. You might. Anybody want to volunteer to help him find that real quick? So I'll just go ahead and keep moving on. Brother Brian, you want to help him out real quick? All right. All right. So today we're going to look at the concept of God, or begin looking at it anyways. The series now is Theology Proper, or the Doctrine of God. Like I said, there's 7 major points, but we're going to be breaking them down into a whole lot of lessons. Kind of like our ABCs of Christian Maturity. It takes a while to get through one letter. And so in this section, or in this series, we will deal with the concept of God, the existence of God, the essence of God, the nature of God in his natural attributes, the nature of God in his moral attributes. We'll look at the sovereignty of God and the names and titles of God. And so as we look at all of those things, now some of those things you might be like, I have no idea what you just said. Well, that's okay, because when we get into that particular study, there's more than one page. So we'll be going over a lot of different things. And so here today, concerning the concept of God, we're starting, obviously, where do we start? We start somewhere in the middle. We start in the beginning, right? And so the very first book of the Bible, the very first chapter of the Bible, the very first verse in the Bible presupposes the existence of God. Now, that may sound like a big word there, but to presuppose means that you just assume his existence. There's no real argument there. In fact, God starts out his word without even trying to explain himself or prove himself. God starts his word just assuming that you know he's there. Starts his word. It's kind of like, if I walked up to you for the very first time and tried to prove to you that I exist. Why would I do that? I think that would kind of be a little bit of maybe. I think that may kind of lean toward the fact that maybe I just question my own existence or something. Now, why would God question his own existence and try to prove that he exists? Doesn't make sense. So when people begin to question his existence, and they say, well, God proved to me that you exist. It's kind of like walking up to somebody, even though, God is spirit and we can't see him. Just because you can't see him, it's like somebody calls you on the phone and you're like, hello? Like, who's this? This is Joe Schmo. All right, Joe, I don't know that you really exist. I've never seen you before. I need you to prove to me that you exist. And Joe's like, well, I've never seen you either. It's proved to me that you exist. Does that seem to make sense? No. The opening statement here he gives is, in the beginning, God, Genesis 1:1. The Bible begins with the presupposition that God exists and does not offer philosophical arguments for his existence. And in fact, any philosophical argument against the existence of God presupposes that he does exist. It's kind of like trying to prove God does not exist has to by the fact of trying to argue with God about something or argue with God about his existence presupposes his existence. It's a self-refuting argument. And so anyways, he says theology proper begins with two assumptions. One, that God exists, and that he has revealed himself to man. These assumptions are neither illogical nor fanciful. They are both reasonable and evidential. I love that like these series like happen to just mesh together because it's amazing. We get to this, we start talking about these things, the evidence and this and that. Y'all, anybody know what chapter of the book of Hebrews we're starting today? Chapter 11. And I may not get past verse 1. And we're going to be talking about a lot of the same stuff, a lot of the same concepts. Isn't it great how God works? He just like puts all this stuff together. I don't schedule this stuff this way. It just happens. So it's a blessing the way that the Lord works these things out. So we're going to look here at the logical concept of God. But before we do, I want to just make a quick announcement that I should have made before our opening. There's looks like a roll of something back there on the table, on the coffee counter, whatever you call that. And it's got a cover for the book of John and Romans on it. That is, it has a hole in the top, and the goal is to fill that thing up with funds to give to the Bible printing ministry. The youth have one back there too, and we don't want them to beat us. So we want to get that filled up before they get theirs filled up. And then we take it and give it to them. They'll pop the top off and empty out the funds and use that to print Bibles. It's the Bearing Precious Seed down in Greenwood. So anyway, so that's, we've got that, and there's your quick announcement. So we'll go back on to our study here. I'll mention it again in the morning service, but just kind of I wanted to throw it out there because it's primarily like Sunday school, like competing Sunday school classes to an extent. And so that's kind of why I did it that way. So this first point here, the logic of a concept of God. Let me quickly though give you the high points of this particular well, he calls it lecture. Obviously, we're not going to be here for 4 or 5 hours to spend on completing the lecture. So over the next few weeks, we're going to cover the logic of a concept of God. We're going to look at false concepts of God. We're going to look at true concepts of God and definitions of God, or quote unquote definitions of God. And that's the basic 4 points that we're going to deal with. And there's a lot of sub points under each of those. So under the logic of a concept of God, he says the fact of the existence of God is a first truth. A first truth is a knowledge that is intuitive. Y'all know what intuitive means? Okay, the word intuition might be related to that. What does that have to do with? Intuitive, something that's intuitive. Something that just seems to just make sense, right? Something that's intuitive. I didn't define the word. It's like common sense, right? So when we talk about, the word intuitive is used a whole lot when dealing with like computers and software and things like that, right? And you talk about, they say, oh, the iPhone, it was so intuitive when it first came out. I don't know. I think it was. In fact, I pick up one of those Google things and I'm like, what in the world is this? I have no idea how to work it. And I'm like, it's counterintuitive. But this is, and so intuitive has to do with your mental capacity just understanding it. It just makes sense. And so, the gestures and things like that, that was the whole point of the intuitive nature of that. Like when they came out with Windows back in the day that were like, this is so much more intuitive than DOS, right? it's end user friendly, right? You can, anybody can pick it up and figure out how it works. And then when Macintosh starts coming out with their stuff, and everybody, that term was used a lot in that way, that you just somehow know how it works. Well, just the same, you just somehow just know that God is there. It's a part of who we are. It's a first truth. It's the knowledge of His existence is just there.
You know what it says in Romans?
Yes, and we're probably going to touch on that in the morning service. I don't remember if we're going to touch on it in this. I reviewed this 2 weeks ago, and a lot of things happen in 2 weeks. So I was going to review it last night, but I ended up having a headache and getting behind on things. So, but anyways, I mean, I've taught it a few times, so it's pretty fluid in my mind. In fact, the whole first paragraph, I kind of just went on, autopilot, because I already kind of knew what the plan was there. So anyways, so he says here that it is not derived from observation, reading, or reflection. Intuition may be defined. Here's the definition he gives, as I try to give you guys that. But he says intuition may be defined as knowing something without having to be told. Right? It's kind of like we were talking about the gestures and this and that. It's like, some of that stuff, you just kind of, oh, that's how that works. Makes sense. Right? That was the idea of them making it so that you don't have to be taught how to do it. Although I did the tutorials and all that, when, not about the knowledge of God, but the computer stuff, right? So that I would understand better how it works. Kind of like the same. We know God's there, but we don't really understand Him very well. And so He's given us His Word to understand Him, right? And so in terms of this, the intuitive knowledge that we have of His existence, we begin to know things about life, say around maybe 4 years old or so. We begin to know that there's like right and wrong and things like that, like a little after 2, like maybe 2.5, 3 years old. We hear, in fact, some kids get it earlier than that, where the parents, they'll say no. And they know, when mom and dad says that word, I'm not supposed to do something. There's something I'm not supposed to do. And so they don't like think all that out. It's just that God's put in them somewhat of a moral compass that they constantly break. That's what we do all of our life, right? But He's given us a little bit of an understanding. Another one of the first truths is a knowledge of good and evil, which is passed down from Adam and Eve, but or a conscience. But this the knowledge of God, as we grow up, as we get a little older, we don't have to be told that we were made. We just know that we were. The fact that we know that we exist kind of leans toward the understanding that there had to be a cause for our existence. And so that cause for our existence, of course, is God. So he says our belief in God is intuitive. It exists in all men, whether admitted or not. Some people claim to be atheist. They had to train themselves to be that way. No one's born an atheist. It's something that they reason themselves into using illogical reasoning, or rather illogical lack of reasoning. But he says here, so this knowledge or this belief exists in all men and would exist even if it were possible from birth to allow the mind to develop apart from the senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, or smell. I believe this is a very trying to think of the best way to say it. I've got a cousin who never has never seen anything before. Can't talk. She can laugh and cry and things like that, but has never learned language per se. Never, just has a little bit of an issue hearing, but can hear, um, but can't really see things. Doesn't really understand, as far as I know, what's going on around her. But she somehow knows certain people when they come into the room. Somehow knows people. She knows some concepts, I guess. I mean, we have no way of communicating with her, but when when my aunt and uncle would talk, sometimes they'd talk about God and angels and whatever, and and she would smile and she would be happy about the things, those kind of things. It's kind of interesting that someone who, and she's had severe cerebral palsy, so lots of things that we take for granted. She's never walked, never. She's been in a like a wheelchair type situation all of her life. No communication with other people, really, one way communication. But that the belief in God, however simple it may be, still there. It's interesting when I was in high school. I was over there and I asked my aunt, I said, do you think that she has any concept of who God is? And we're sitting there in the room with her and she smiled and, and kind of like did her little laugh thing, like, yeah, I know who God is, no real communication, but it's just it's interesting to consider those things that even apart from a lot of our senses, we have in our thinking capacity, however great or small it is, an understanding that we're not just an accident. Yes, sir.
Like a soul inside an impaired body. There she just can't use the body because it's impaired. She just can't acknowledge it.
I really don't know how that works, but um, yeah, I mean, yeah, there's personality there and everything. It's just hard to communicate, But and it's that way with a lot of handicapped folks that maybe couldn't speak or couldn't, and it's amazing though to find that when some of those disabilities, um, there's some breakthrough and somehow the disability kind of goes away. It's amazing to find out that there's a lot of reasoning there that just has never been given out, or that it's not that they went and read a bunch of books or anything, but there's a lot of basic understanding that people have as people, that for many years they know. A lot of people would just think that they just don't know, and then yep, yeah. And that's the amazing thing about people, is we just think that if somebody's not able to talk, they just don't know anything, but that's not necessarily the case. Yes, sir.
Basically, it's like having this, let's say, like conscious reasoning within you.
Mm-hmm.
And as we grow and as we read, those things are developed, and that's how we learn.
Mm-hmm.
But those things are there for the outset.
Right. Well, and there's, so I don't want to get too far into like philosophical thought necessarily, but I will say though that having an understanding of self-existence demands the question of how. That makes sense? So just knowing that you exist, having self-awareness, which is kind of that whole philosophical concept of man, is we're self-aware. We're aware of ourselves and our existence, and we have an awareness of the existence around us. And because of that awareness, it requires us to, through by basic logic that God placed in us, it requires us to consider the existence of one who caused our existence. Does that make sense? I know I might be talking way, psychobabble stuff, but it's logical truth. And And so anyway, so as we go through, he says that the knowledge of God is the unique feature of man who is a spiritual being, possessing God consciousness. Such knowledge is a universal, because all men manifest a belief in some God. Man has a religious nature. It's interesting, no matter where you go in the world, no matter how civilized or uncivilized the culture, every human being on the planet, every human culture, every society, no matter how complex or simple, has some concept of some God. Everywhere you go to the middle of the jungle in Africa, you go to the middle of the wilderness in Russia, you find Aboriginal people who have never been in contact with quote unquote modern social society. And what are you going to find? You're going to find some sort of religious ritual, some sort of, some way that they're trying to figure out how to connect with God. What do they need? Well, they need the special revelation of God to understand who God is, to know how to connect with him. And so there's your concept for missions, right? We go and we give them that. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to like our God, because they already have their own false concept of God. But still yet, they recognize that there's some creator. Somehow they got there. And we all have within us the not only the understanding that there is a God, but if we've been made by someone, then that someone deserves our worship. It's just a common thing. You go to the simplest of cultures, and what do they have as a kind of a requirement almost of every culture, is that they in some way try to connect with their God. And so the concept of God is very logical. It's placed within us. In fact, even the word logic itself, actually, I've been studying English a little bit. Was that this week? My goodness, it's been a long week. I did what would be considered like a half credit hour course on Monday. It was just on Monday, an 8-hour session of study on the English language from AD 500 to today. So it was fun. It was really fun. And then I came across another book yesterday about it. But anyways, really neat how the English language came to be. Just some, you guys might think I know a lot about the English language. As I did that study, I was like, man, there's a lot I didn't know about the English language. This is amazing. It's great. But the word logic is it's the derivative. It's comes from Latin, but Greek and Latin are cousins. And so the word in our Bible that is very close to this word is logos. Okay, now that's the Greek word. The word logos, as you go through the Bible, it in most cases, it's speaking of the word or logic, having to do with or reasoning. In fact, when the Bible says, "In the beginning was the Word," I have parts of that memorized in Greek, but not all of it, so I won't try to say it. But it's anyways. In the beginning was the Word. That's the word there is logic, or not logic, but logos. It's logos, and it's that family, we'll say, that we get the word logic. And so when we consider the concept of God, and think about this, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Very logic itself. where we get logic from, it's God. And then you look at all things were made by him. Then you start thinking about Proverbs, where it says, where it talks about wisdom, and wisdom, hath builded her house, and so on, and this, and wisdom personified begins to talk about how, quote unquote, she, using the feminine term because it's because you're personifying a thought concept, although we believe that wisdom, that's connected actually with the word. But anyways, in the book of Proverbs, you have, I was there when the foundations of the earth. I'm not quoting, I'm kind of paraphrasing. So like when God set the foundation of the earth, when he put the stars in the sky, when he did all that, wisdom was there. Right? And we're gonna touch on Hebrews 11, verse, I think it's 3, where it says, by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the Logos, by the word of God, right? And so anyway, so this concept of God, or the logic of a concept of God, comes, or is it's amazing that the concept of God comes from God himself, and the Creator placed within us this logic, or this little bit of light, as John 1 would say, the light lighteth every man that cometh into the world. We have this, you start thinking about how all this stuff like matches together, and you're like, right? Your brain just begins to like race in 4 different directions or maybe just 3 different directions, and mm-hmm. And that very fact also points toward the existence of God. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Romans were. Yeah, they definitely had a concept of some sort of God. Now, as we talk about the concept of God, this is a general concept. We're not talking about specifically. Well, it's a general concept that everyone has, that man by himself just messes it up, perverts it, and you end up with paganism, or you end up with worshiping the creature more than the Creator. All of those kind of things just happen because man's sinful, and without God's word telling us who he is, we try to figure out who he is, and we say, well, maybe my ancestors are God, or maybe the sun is God, or maybe it's the tornado, or maybe it's this powerful thing or that powerful thing. And we start thinking, well, maybe man came down from Mars, or maybe Jupiter or something, or maybe aliens seeded us on the earth or something. So but you have to appeal to somehow we got here, and it's a universal understanding, a universal knowledge that there is some sort of God. Every man has a universal knowledge of that. It's also necessary, he says, because the mind of man is compelled by its very nature to the recognition of God. Again, I'm kind of laboring the same points, and I think he is too, but it's also prime, because such knowledge cannot be broken down into other basic forms, or does not need to be proved by other facts. It's just it's a simple prime, like there's nothing that kind of leads up to that knowledge. It's just there, right? But that knowledge continues on to a lot of application. But yes, sir.
You think too that man believe in God, but in our mind we start to form him into the God that we want him to be.
That's exactly right, because man was made in God's image, but man tries to turn God into his own image. And that's the issue, is like we recognize the existence of God, and we do to a certain degree understand that we were made in his image. But then on the other side of that, we get it wrong, and we think that the image that we portray is who God is. Well, and we can talk more about, well, man was made in God's image, 3 parts, just like God. We have body, soul, and spirit. And there's Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So anyways, so that's the fact, or the simplicity of our being made in his image and in his likeness. But then we try to take everything about us and make him that. Well, there are some attributes that we have that match the attributes of God, but not perfectly like he has them. So so we'll go on here. So the intuitive concept of God can be developed and established by observation, reflection, reason, and of course, revelation. However, it is independent of all these. We would know there is a supreme being even if there was no Bible. That's what our very first lesson on bibliology was, that even without the Bible, we would know the existence of God based on the fact that he's placed within us general revelation of himself. He's placed within his creation the general revelation, revealing himself to his creation simply by the fact that he created. And so he says, this first truth says that God is, and to some extent, what God is. Okay, to some extent. And then he says, note, the scriptures assume this first truth. They assume God's existence and man's intuition of this fact. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, remember, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Hebrews 11, verse 6, ironically, right? But without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. So this rational intuition of God must be developed into a factual presentation of God. How do we do that? Well, we'll do that as we go along through the study. So I'm done faster than I wanted to be with that section. I was thinking that would just be the whole lesson, but we may go ahead and go into point 2 here on false concepts of God. Then we'll end up going over on time. But yes, sir.
That was called a spin off. I remember talking a week or 2 ago about something you saw on the History Channel that referred to God being aliens.
Mm-hmm.
In this particular
episode. Yeah, about every episode.
Attributed a lot of that to early Assyrian kings.
Uh-huh.
And even some of the hieroglyphics, some of the markings that they showed a human form with like a deformed, like they're kind of human, but they're not really human.
Like an elongated head or something?
Yeah. That type of thing.
It's interesting. Is that? No, that's a different, that's just burly dudes that, that had a different, those were people. They weren't any less, but yes.
All that kind of stuff.
I was, last night while I had a headache, I was just kind of like, just randomly watching this. I do History Channel or Science Channel. That's about all I do, if I do anything like that. And it's very rare, but I was watching this show called What on Earth, and it had like stuff that they saw from satellites and stuff. And they found this little town. It was a Aryan. That's funny that they found this. It was way after the Nazis were gone and stuff. And they scoured the whole earth looking for proof of an Aryan race at one point. Well, there was this little town, a little circular town that they found that could have housed about 250,000 people, I think it was. And they're excavating it. Is in Russia, and they're excavating it, and they found pottery with swastikas on it. Not Nazi swastikas, but where the Nazis got the swastika. But anyways, and then they start finding skeletons like that were buried in the town, and one of them was, or multiple of them had. And the reason they knew this was because they had the devices they were using to do that to themselves. They actually had forced the elongation of their head because of their false concept of God. Because there was a lot of that in history. There's a lot of that concept. I believe that kind of goes back to that time before the flood, when there's all this weird stuff going on, where these people are getting a false concept. And so, hey, false concepts of God. Yes.
Well, it's funny that you bring that up, because if you look into African tribal rituals,
mm-hmm.
and they were always shown as putting stuff in their lips and their ears,
lips and ears and neck and head. Yep.
So that's kind of the same thing.
Right. And it just goes back to trying to figure out God without having the right reference point, And so now the first false concept of God. So here he says the belief in the existence of God as a higher power or supreme being is natural and normal. However, from this point, man's understanding of God has deviated from the truth because of vain imaginations, right? They became vain in their imaginations and so on. So vain imaginations, what's that sound like? Stuff you dream up, right? Resulting in many false concepts of God. Now, of course, the first false concept of God is that, well, you know what? I don't like the fact that I've got to answer to anybody, so I'm a atheist. That's your first false. Yes. So, and that is exactly it. I don't like the fact that I would ever have to answer to anybody. And you know what? The millennials didn't come up with that concept, although they really, really champion that concept. I don't have to answer to anybody. I'm my own person and whatever. Bunch of childish garbage like that. What's that? And I'm offended about everything. And I have the right to be. Right, exactly. I need somebody to itch my ears and so on and so on. So, but if I'm even gonna accept the thought that maybe I have to answer to anybody, I want to have to, and so that's where we get into some of the other stuff. Is if I'm going to accept the thought that I have to answer to somebody, then that somebody I have to answer to has to be the kind of somebody that would like me the way I am, without having to change myself to be the way they want me to be. Does that make sense? So the first thing is to deny existence altogether, because then I don't have to answer to anybody, right? Life is what it is. What happens, right? Que sera, and what will be, and you just live life. You're going to be planted in a dirt, take a dirt nap or whatever. No nap, actually. You're just going to go to the dirt, and you're no more, and that's all it is, right? That's what they say. And then they say, if I'm going to contribute in any fashion, it's just going to be to the next generation. And what's the point in that anyways, right? But atheism is the unnatural and abnormal, or is unnatural and abnormal, because it is a denial of the existence of God. It denies what is intuitive, and in most cases is really a fake or suppressed assertion by people. And it manifests itself in three different ways. You have the practical atheism. For various reasons, many people have chosen to discard God from their thinking and life. You have virtual atheism. That's not internet atheism, but I know we used the word differently before internet came around. But virtual atheism, people have adopted various philosophies like materialism or communism, things like that, which require no belief in God. Okay. And then you have dogmatic atheism, or some people openly boast their denial of God's existence. And of course, we have scripture that, that points to those folks in Romans 1:22 and Psalm 14:1. So, but again, atheism, and sometimes atheism gets to a point. Is he trying to find out if anybody's in there? Oh, so atheism often gets to the point where so materialistic atheism, here's the thing. In recent days, materialistic atheism has come to a point where they've begun to realize that they just can't prove themselves. And so because of that, you have a whole series on the History Channel of ancient aliens. And you have people who have PhDs. Don't laugh now, or laugh if you want to, it's fine. You have people who have PhDs, and they're called ancient astronaut theorists. Yes. And what that means is people believe in aliens.
Everything they talk about is legit until
yes.
It gets to the point of God, and then the alien instead of God. But
that's exactly right. It's exactly right. And by the way, that's the reason I watch it sometimes, is to see. It's like they see the logic that God put in them, and then they deny it and say it had to be some material answer for it. because they don't want to recognize an immaterial, or a spirit God who made us. They don't want to recognize that.
Like architecture stuff.
Yeah.
Talking about, like, the stone that
Yep.
was, like, cut out, like,
Yeah.
perfectly square,
I've
but
spent
it's
way
like-
too many hours looking at that stuff. Way too many hours. But it's actually kind of neat. They show some of those things, and then you're like, man, you just don't get it.
It shows you've got 100%, but then it's like aliens, so you're just like.
Why? That's exactly right. You're like, you're right there. You're so close. And then they're like, nope. And that is the epitome of atheism. When you see this and they see the facts and they see the truth and they see it, and they cannot deny it. And so they have to come up with some other answer. They replace God with another creature, another material being. What's that? Yes, that's exactly right. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And that's exactly what happens. You had something?
Don't you think it's amazing that people dream up these imaginations, and the whole root is to justify their own existence?
That's exactly right.
You know, I mean, like,
They want to justify their existence without having to.
why am I here?
Yeah. Well, and man wants to justify his existence without having to recognize his responsibility for existence. And so, and I'll be honest with you though, you guys, it's not just atheists that do that though. Christians do that. They want to justify their existence and their interaction with the cosmos, the system, right? And they want to justify it, rightfully so. They want to understand it. They want to understand what their part is. But then when God reveals their part, they want to say, "Oh, no, that's not what I want to do. I want to do this." What's that? Yeah, I just want to go to church once a week. I want to I want to be a spectator and cover my bases. I want to just make sure that I got the boxes checked off. I'm good to go. But that's not what God ever has designed for man. I mean, every point of our existence points back to something we're supposed to do with it. Now, of course, we recognize that every point of our existence and that pointing back to something we're supposed to do with it is a constant reminder that we're flawed and sinful. And so that's why they don't like it. And whether they try to reason it some other way, that's why they don't like it. That's why, by the way, Christians go to places that tell them, that give them, or quote unquote Christian, people who profess Christ, they'll go to places that they can hear things like, hey, you just got to name it and claim it. And you live your best life now. No, my best life's later. It's in heaven. All right. So I'm going to live now for what's, for heaven. And so all of the things that I'm going to do in this life is going to be, all the things I'm going to do in this life is going to be for the next. That's right. And so when we begin to think about the logic of our existence, and we begin to think about, what we owe God for existing, it begins to sometimes get difficult because we recognize that we don't measure up. But then as we by faith walk in the grace of God, of course, by faith, trusting in his substitutional sacrifice for our sins, and then we put off that old man by faith and by grace through faith, and then we and then we're created for good works, right? He says, I'm trying to quote part of it without quoting all of it, so it's hard to do. So, for by grace we're saved through faith, and that not of ourselves. This is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them. And that's what is going to happen as we recognize that he's able to do that, as we just simply trust in him. And I don't want to preach the morning message yet, so I'm going to leave some of that out, but I'm trying to get there. It's amazing how God does that sometimes. I still have in my head that I may go through half the book or half the chapter of Hebrews 11, but I don't think I will. I think I'll probably just get verse 1 and verse 3 done, and that's about it. So, yes, sir.
You know, you come up with these vain imaginations.
Mm-hmm.
Did we get to that point where we realize, whether we accept it or not, we realize that there's a God, but we deny it, so we won't have to spend the rest of our lives trying to measure something that we can't measure up to.
Right. Right.
Whether there's a God,
And
whether you make him God or yourself God.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and that whole thing. So instead of recognizing that there's a God, and then recognize and then trying to measure up to it, we ought to recognize there's a God, recognize we can't measure up to our responsibility, but he can through us. And so we're just going to real quick talk about Gnosticism. I hope real quick. That could open a whole longer discussion, but we're going to try to just cram that in the next 4 minutes, and then we'll move on. Or not Gnosticism, I'm sorry, agnostic. If I could speak English today, that would be great. Agnosticism. So you have atheists, then you have agnostics. So the word comes from the Greek, a or not there, and gnoso has to do with knowing. In other words, it literally means to not know. And so the equivalent there is the equivalent Latin word to the Greek agnostic is ignoramus. Someone who's ignorant of something, you don't know it, right? Although we take that to be in English, if we use that word because we adopted the word from Latin, it actually means something different than what it meant in Latin. It wasn't necessarily a derogatory or an offensive statement. It was just someone who didn't know or doesn't know much. We take it to be like a totally like
doesn't know anything.
it's just a bad, you call me that and
Yeah.
it's a bad, it's kind of like in English, you may say something is stupid. In Spanish, if you say that, they consider it cursing. And so, some of those words, that's the way it comes across. I put a little smiley face next to the word in my book here. So agnosticism affirms the impossibility of ever knowing the certainty of God. It is a form of skepticism, like atheism. It too is unnatural and abnormal. Although it's kind of like atheism, and this is the way a lot of agnostics, will present it. Basically, they would say, "I was an atheist, and then I became agnostic, and then, if they became a Christian, or believer, then it's kind of like I went from this to this to this." But no, in all reality, you went from recognizing there was a God to denying there was a God, to recognizing that your denial is illogical, to then recognizing that, oh, he was right altogether from the beginning. So someone pointed out, he says here, that the agnostic cannot find God for the same reason a thief cannot find a policeman. Right? Because he's running away. Not looking for him. So yeah, so the first two, we're gonna deal with 4 more. We'll work on that next week. But the first two false concepts of God there. Of course, we talked about the logical concept of God, or the logic of a concept of God. And then the first two false concepts were atheism and agnosticism.